Nikita Koloff, the Russian Nightmare, and you are listening to Wrestling for the Faith with Casey Kage. Stay tuned or I come after you.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Wrestling for the Faith. I'm your host, Casey Kage. Thank you for joining us today. And today, I am honored to be joined by wrestling legend, the one and only, the Russian Nightmare, Nikita Koloff. Nikita, how are you doing, sir?
Casey, I am doing marvelous. I appreciate you having me on for the interview. I've been looking forward to it. Great to be here.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. We're glad to have you, and I'm sure that this is going to be a well listened to episode. I know that there are some who don't know too much about what you've been into since you walked away from wrestling, so I'm definitely wanting to get into that in depth. But I guess we could start from the beginning. Another area that I just doing a little bit of research on your beginning that kind of caught me by surprise was.
I'm not from Russia.
Well, Moscow, Minnesota. Is that right?
Yeah. Except there's a Moscow, Idaho, I think, but not a Moscow, Minnesota. But anyway. Hey, by the way, I got to say this while I'm thinking of it. One, I love the title of your show, but secondly, your name strikes a memory from kind of back in my childhood. I'm not even sure what his title was, but his name was Casey Kage. He used to do the top 40 songs, you know?
Yeah, Casey Kasem. I remember that.
Yeah, I bet you Casey Kage. I'm like, man, it almost sounds like Casey Kasem. Anyway, little side note there. It means nothing for your listeners or your viewers.
So you actually grew up in Minnesota. Now, one of the things in my research, when I was looking into this, I found it very interesting that you were a part of the group of guys who came out of that Robbinsdale area.
Yeah. That
exploded on the wrestling scene. So how exactly did your school years go, and tell the listeners who were some of the people that you were involved with during that time?
Back in the early days of life. Yeah, it's, I've been asked that a few times. Man, what was it about Robbinsdale High School or Robbinsdale? I go, well, it's a land of 10,000 lakes, they say, so it must have been all the minerals in the water tower. That's the only conclusion I can draw why we had so many guys out of Robbinsdale High School. But in a period of years, a nucleus of guys, including myself, a guy wrestled as Nord the Barbarian, Nord the Berserker, John Nord. A guy that graduated after us was a guy named Barry Darso, who might be known as Demolition, a.k.a. Crusher Khrushchev, one of our partners back in the day. In addition to that, who graduated before us, Tom Zink, the Z-Man, Brady Boone, who was probably the lesser known of all of us, but he had a little run in the WWF and certainly with the NWA. And then two of the other superstars that came out of that group were Ravishing Rick Rude and Mr. Perfect Kurt Hennig. And five of us, 1 year, all played on the same high school football team. So kind of crazy.
Now, Road Warrior Animal was also, wasn't he in that group?
He gets mixed in because his high school sounded similar. Road Warrior Animal went to Irondale High School in New Brighton, Minnesota. And the irony there is, though, that I literally, in college, I was part of the recruiting team. And I literally recruited him out of high school to come play college football with me. That's how we became friends, the best of friends, and played a few years of college football together.
Okay. I knew that there was a close friendship between you and Animal.
Yep.
So where were you on your path in life when you got the call? Because from what I understand, you were initially not planning a career in professional wrestling.
I wasn't. I mean, it was not on my radar. I mean, it wasn't like I was oblivious to it. I mean, back in the day, we had what was called the AWA All-Star Wrestling with Vern Gagne, who owned that organization, who so happened to be, by the way, a graduate of Robbinsdale High School, but much years earlier, along with an announcer by the name of Mean Gene Okerlund. He was also out of Robbinsdale High School.
Wow.
Yeah, kind of crazy. So, I mean, I was familiar with pro wrestling, and in my college days, I actually worked out and trained at a little sweatbox gym in North Minneapolis called Ventura's Gym. That name might ring a bell.
I wonder who owned that.
Yeah. Hello, the Body, Jesse the Body. Later became Jesse the Mind, Governor Ventura.
Yeah.
But and so, you know, I was familiar with it, but from about the age of 12, my heart, my passion, you know, my focus was weightlifting, bodybuilding, football. I lived, ate, and breathed it all through junior high and high school on into college.
So wasn't it Animal who called you to bring you in? Tell us that story. I think I heard you tell it on an interview, and I just thought that was very interesting and how you were presented your gimmick and all of this from Crockett and those guys.
Yeah, so I guess turnabout is fair play, right? So I make the call and recruit Animal out of high school. He makes a phone call. He didn't finish college. I went on and finished and graduated college. He dropped out, and next thing I know, he's on the Superstation, you know, in Georgia Championship Wrestling, and I knew he was going through a camp. You know, he had told me, him and some of the guys, I think Rude Darso, Henning, a few of the guys were going through the camp, and then lo and behold, he's making a name for himself. And I got a random call one morning from him introducing me to the idea, the concept of a nephew for Ivan Koloff. Kind of shared the story with me, and I said, do they know that I have no amateur wrestling background and zero professional training? Like, I've never been to a camp, a school, in a ring, you know, not. And he goes, yeah, and so he goes, here, call this guy Jim Crockett in Charlotte, North Carolina. He's the promoter. So I did. So I hung up. I called Jim Crockett and made sure he understood. No background in wrestling, you know, didn't dream as a child of being a wrestler. You know, this is my dream come true. It wasn't one of those stories. He understood that. And I'm like, and you're good with that? He's like, yep. And I, you know, well, then what's next? He goes, be in my office on such and such a day with your head-shaped ball. I go, that's it. And then I didn't have it. That was it. A 5-minute conversation. You know, there's no cell phones. There's no selfies. You know, it was just a conversation. I showed up the day he said to be there with everything I owned to my name, which wasn't much, and all the money I had to my name, which was not a whole lot. Walked in, introduced myself, and that day, Nikita Koloff was birthed and born in the hallways of Charlotte, North Carolina.
Wow, that's a pretty cool story from knowing what, you know, a lot of the guys go through to get in, and
yeah,
man, you had a great connection in Animal. Did you ever get in a conversation of what made him think that you would play the perfect Russian?
Well, Don Cornotto, who was Ivan Koloff's partner, they were the World Tag Team Champions. So just a little more backstory. Don Cornotto and Sergeant Slaughter were the ones who actually came up with the whole storyline of a nephew for Ivan Koloff. One, to kind of extend his career, but I mean, they laid the whole thing out to Ivan. He liked it. They laid it out to Jim Crockett. He thought, well, you can find somebody. So literally, Don went to Animal and simply asked this question. One question. Hey, do you know any big guys who wouldn't mind shaving their head and becoming a Russian? That was the question. And Animal, without hesitating, goes, I know the guy right now. And that's when he made the phone call to me and told me the story. And I called Jim Crockett. Yeah, the rest was, as the old cliche goes, the rest was history. But that was it.
Wow.
Do you know any big guys who wouldn't mind shaving their head and becoming a Russian?
Well, I definitely would have done that especially for that time period and working for Crockett and that the opportunity at the money during that time.
I mean, right place, right time. Now, well, let me speak into that just very quickly. When you consider where wrestling's at today, it was not always like that. In fact, for your listeners, understand that back in those days, there were no contracts. We were paid by how many people were in the building. Mm-hmm. Whether there were 15 people or 15,000 people, we were paid. And Crockett had some kind of formula, from opening match to main event. I never, to this day, never did figure out his formula, but apparently he had one. Okay. But our guarantee, you ready for this, Casey? Our guarantee was $50.
Oh, wow.
We'd make at least $50, even if there was nobody in the building. And out of that came our gas money and our food, our travel expenses, etc. That was our guarantee.
Now that's pretty interesting. I know for me, I've heard all the stories from a lot of the guys, about the $40 and $50 guarantee and from back in the day. And I know, when I was working, when I moved up in the ranks on the independents, there was times where, promoters and a lot of old school Tennessee promoters, would call me and say, hey, I'll give you $40. And I'm thinking, man, but I guess at that time, the guarantee that actually meant something. And a lot of those guys stuck with that $40 or $50 range. Yeah.
And I think, again, for those who aren't familiar, I mean, we're talking back in the days where there were territories all over the country, right? I mean, everywhere. There was so many, the Northwest with Don Owens, world class with Von Erichs, Tully's dad, Joe Blanchard, had it in San Antonio. I mean, you go, Georgia Championship Wrestling, Florida Champion Wrestling, Mid-Atlantic, Mid-South, Tennessee with the Jarretts and, Nick Goulas, and St. Louis with Harley Race. I mean, they were all over. The AWA with Vern, the WWWF with Vince McMahon Sr. up in the Northeast. So you could leverage yourself. And of course, obviously, if you've made a name for yourself, you could leverage yourself for, a bigger payday as you made a name for yourself. But in those days, sometimes, the crowds were pretty thin. And so you at least knew you were going to get paid something, versus nothing.
And there was a lot more work back then, too, as far as nightly.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I tell you, if you're not familiar, I tell the story. In 1986, I had 454 matches. So you do the math on that. Well, let's see. There's only 365 days in a year. How'd that work? We had some busy weekends. Wow. But you essentially work every single night. That's correct.
I wish that I would have had the opportunity to break in during that time, because that's always been my passion, was mainly like the 80s wrestling. I mean, I studied 80s NWA, whenever I was breaking in. That was always the stuff that I was studying. I was always studying Dusty and Flair and, all these great matches during that time period. And that's, when I talk to younger guys in the business, that's what I tell them to go back and study.
Right.
Go back to the territories, go back to these guys and study this product.
Yeah. And a lot of guys, some of the younger guys I've talked to as well have voiced that very same thing, that's the era. And the fans that I talk to call it in their view, the golden era of wrestling.
Yes.
And most of them, based on what they've said to me, just don't, they'll never see that era repeated in that way. But yeah, many of the guys in the business have voiced to me that very thing. That's what they've not only continue to study. They continue to study.
Right. So you come in and they slap this Russian nightmare gimmick on you. They put you in the car with Ivan and Don, or how does that work?
Yeah, immediately. The first day, the day I walked in the office, cutting interviews, and we did about 6 or 7 hours of interviews. And of course, I didn't talk because I'm right off the boat. I'm straight from Russia off the Soviet liner, and so Crockett said, "Take your shirt off. Ivan, put your chains around his neck. Anytime they do an interview, I want you on the set with the shirt off, stand there, look mean." I thought, all right, and we didn't even talk money, and I was just like, oh, and I get paid for this, okay. And then we finished, and they said, be in Raleigh. Crockett said, be in Raleigh, North Carolina tomorrow night in the Dorton Arena. You're going to wrestle on television. So I'm going to debut on television, having never been in a ring.
Wow.
Yeah, talk about thrown into the fire, so to speak. In fact, I talked to Don Cornotto just a few weeks ago. Every time I talk to Don, he's like, just blows my mind that we just threw you in there. But he said, but you pulled it off, man. You pulled it off. So yes, for the next 2+ years, I traveled with Don. It was just me, Don, and Ivan typically, or basically, especially at least the first year anyway.
And I know that there was a lot of knowledge that you soaked up during that time. I know I've told guys, and a lot of the guys don't get the opportunity as much as they used to. But I know, for me, a lot of the guys, when I first started, who took me under their wing, I learned more in the car rides on the way to the towns than I did in the ring training.
Well, yeah. Well, we would do. Then I had on-the-job training after my debut, my 11-second win on television. Then for the next 2-3 months, Ivan, Don, and I would get to the towns 2-3 hours early. They'd bump and thump all over the ring, teaching me the mechanics of wrestling. I'd have a very, very short squash match with 1 or 2 opponents. They'd have a world title defense of their belts, their tag belts. I'd sit in their corner. Ivan would sit in my corner. And then every night on the way home, we discussed old school psychology. Mm-hmm. And that's where, as you're referring to, I really gleaned, one, to be able to watch their match and observe it sitting ringside, and then secondly, talk about it on the drive home every night. And fortunately, I was, I guess, a fairly good student and teachable and coachable.
Yeah. I know I didn't get to know Ivan too well. I know that I had talked to him. I was running Global Wrestling Ministries in 2015, and I had him booked to come in and do autographs and give his testimony. And the event that we had him booked on, there ended up being a snowstorm, so we had to postpone it. And then in the process of trying to reschedule with him, his health started getting bad, and then eventually passed away. But just the communication that I had with him, I mean, he sounded like a really great guy. Yeah,
he's quite a story, and we can get into as much as you want to get into it. But he had quite a life journey, and of course, I was fortunate to be a part of his transformation as far as from his life in the wrestling world to becoming a Christ follower, and inviting him to a revival service where like literally he did a complete 180. And man, the last number of years of his life, went on to become an ordained minister and just really impacted a lot of people's lives. And he was as much an uncle to me as any uncle I had. So when people say, was he really your uncle? I'm like, well, he wasn't TV land, but really he was outside of the ring, best of friends, and like an uncle to me.
Right. Now, what exactly was going on? I can't remember if he had told me or if I watched it in an interview with him, but what exactly was going on with him at the time? How did you reconnect with him, or did you never lose contact in between that time that you left wrestling and then when you invited him to the revival service?
Yeah, we always, because of the relationship we had built, we maintained a connection even post my wrestling career, even though he continued on and being involved in it. We maintained that relationship, and then once he came to the revival and and came forward to the altar and surrendered his life to the Lord. From that point on, we then saw each other more because we started tag teaming for Jesus. We started, speaking at different churches and outreaches and wrestling things, different events. And so we kept in more and even closer contact. And anytime I got up his way, he was, or we would talk on the phone periodically. I'd pray for him, or he'd ask how he could pray for me. And then his wife, Renee, when he passed, asked if I had a very small, discreet graveside service, asked if I would speak, at his service. Of course, I was honored to do that. So
that's pretty cool. So back to your time in Crockett, you come in as the Russian Nightmare. You, like you said, you're doing these squash matches, and then you and Ivan are tagging. And how exactly did it happen that I know it was somewhere around the time that Magnum had his car accident. How exactly did it happen that this big hated Russian decides to be the partner of the American dream, if you will?
Yeah, it's I didn't know about, again, this is back in the days before cell phones and lots of communication. I was in Japan. I think I was on a 2-week tour in Japan when Magnum had his wreck. And my first night back was in Philadelphia, and Jimmy Crockett and Dusty pulled me into a room. It was just the three of us. And they were telling me about Magnum's accident. Of course, wrestling's a work, right? So I'm like, yeah, whatever. I mean, it took him a while to truthfully convince me that, no, we're like being serious here. I mean, he broke his neck. Looks like he's going to be a quadriplegic the rest of his life. And I'm like, oh my gosh. I'm like, wow. And so Dusty had made a lot of genius, or you might say brilliant moves in the past. Including the Great American Bash, the War Games, and the list could go on and on. But my turn was him and Jimmy Crockett's idea. They left the decision up to me, but I thought to myself, as much experience as Dusty had, and certainly Jim Crockett's family in the wrestling business, they knew a lot more than I did. I mean, I'm still not 2.5 years into this thing. And so, we made the decision. I found out somebody had asked Dusty years later, prior to his passing, specifically when we made that decision, did he know that it would blow up like it did? And he said, no. He goes, none of us knew. I mean, it was a roll of the dice. None of us knew. I think I was perhaps, I don't know, the first Russian babyface, right? The first Russian good guy, right?
Yeah.
The Cold War epitome of evil and all of that, right? So anyway, and so we made that decision. We ran with it, and of course, it exploded, and it was unbelievable.
That's pretty cool. I know that during those times, man, I look back at a lot of those matches, and I wish a lot of times that the sport could be what it was during that time.
A lot of people do, Casey. A lot of people. I still do a lot of autograph signings, legend signings, card shows, virtual signings, and over and over and over again. Man, the fans that's just all they talk about. I wish it could be like that again.
That's sometimes my kids, they'll want to watch wrestling, and I'll say, you can turn on the network, and if you'll turn something on from like the 80s or early 90s, I'm all in. But other than that, I'll sit here with you, but I'm not really paying attention.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a different product, for real. And how I summarize that, because I get asked that question sometimes. How I summarize that is how I feel anyway, in my view, that back in those days, we had a lot of creative control as a wrestler in the ring, in telling a story spontaneously in the ring.
Right.
And the word that we brought up earlier, psychology, played a major factor in how we presented the match and eventually leading into the outcome. Whereas Whereas my understanding now is, there's writers that write the match and write the interview and do all that, and taking nothing away from the athletes and the performers who go out and perform. But if the crowd's not buying into it, you're still essentially required to fulfill what's been written. And that's why you even see a different fan reaction in today's product versus the fan reaction you saw back in the 80s.
Exactly.
Taking the creative control, and psychology doesn't play a factor any longer.
I know there was a lot of times, when I first started, I was brought in with the old school idea, and then I got around some guys, and we got in this what they call the spot fest mentality, and we wanted to plan out every punch, every kick, every look, everything, and
right.
And I started traveling with Nightmare Ted Allen.
Yep.
I'd traveled with him for a couple of months, but I had never actually worked with him in the ring. And we were doing a show for Wild Samoan Sika in Florida, and they put me and Ted on against each other, and I'm like sweating. I'm like, okay, Ted, what are we going to do out there? He said, we're going to listen to the.
What was his answer?
He said, we're going to listen to the people.
Bam.
Yeah. And so, we got out there, and he called the match, told me what to do. And, since then, that's just the way I would much rather do it. And I've worked with so many guys since, and, when they come and ask me the same questions, what are we doing? What are we doing? Sweating, hey, music's about to hit. What are we doing? And I'm like, hey, we'll call it out there. It'll be good. And then we come to the back, and they're like, wow, I've never done that. That was so awesome.
Well, yeah, hello, right? I mean, it's kind of in one sense, and I know they're doing great business. They do. I get it. I mean, it's what it is today. But, it's almost like if it ain't broke, don't fix it, kind of thing, right? But one of the amazing things about all that is, that was the fun part for me, going out to be able to just spontaneously tell a story and listen to the crowd and draw them into the story, right? And in fact, the old adage, I'm sure you probably were told this, in those days, you alluded earlier to, what do you call it, spot fest? Is that what you call it?
Yeah.
So spot fest. And whereas in those days, we were schooled to get the most out of the least. There were moments we paused and took a breath, actually. We'll call them a breathe moment, right? But what those were, too, was to give the fan the opportunity to actually comprehend what they just saw.
Exactly.
Some of these guys do 100 spots in 3 seconds, and I'm watching it, and I can't wrap my head around it. I'm like, how can a fan, if I'm smart, if I can't, and I get it. Again, I get it. The product is what it is today. But yeah, that's why that era was so much fun.
So there's so much more that we could talk about at your first run here, but you ended up taking some time off to be with your first wife. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So, while I was on the road wrestling, she was 24. She got diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma cancer. And she made the decision to go through all the chemo radiation and went through all of that, lost her hair and weight and what comes along with all of that. And it went into remission, but it wasn't long before it came back with even more of a vengeance. And when it did that, it was at that point that I made a decision to step away from wrestling. I told him, I said, look, I'll be back, but this is a priority.
Yes.
It's my wife, and she's got cancer, and so stepped away to take care of her, and unfortunately she passed at the age of 26. So she battled for about 2 years, and it was really kind of my first lesson. I'm thinking I was maybe 30ish years old, and it was really my first close encounter with the brevity of life, just how short life can really be. She was only 26. right? And so it didn't draw me to the foot of the cross yet, but it did nudge me along the way. Looking back, it nudged me along the way.
Yeah, and I'd like to reference you mentioned that, and I was going to refer to the podcast episode that you did on that, and I think that's what you titled it, right?
Yeah, I go into kind of more detail, more full detail on that, and I know that podcast has really ministered to a lot of people. They've come back and said, "Wow, that really touched my heart," or really, I was been going through a struggling time, or that helped me, or so. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of your podcasts that, and I didn't even know. I had deleted my social media for a while, for a couple of years, and then I just recently got back on Twitter and reconnected with you and noticed that you were doing a podcast now, the Man Up podcast, and they're just for my listeners out there. Everybody needs to check it out because there are several episodes on there that have really been a blessing to me, that I've enjoyed the stories, and like you said, a lot of them have ministered to me. So I definitely recommend your podcast.
I appreciate it, and there's a variety. Just for your listeners, there's a variety. I mean, I do have I have some great interviews. I feel like with Sting, Lex Luger, Magnum TA. Jackson Riker, who's currently on Monday Night Raw.
Yes.
And even beyond that, there's some wonderful stories of, I got husbands and wives on there, who just out in the marketplace. There are people, guys in ministry. So it's a whole variety of people that I talk with. And so I'm certain there's probably, in fact, just for the Easter weekend, I did a special Easter show just for the Easter weekend, kind of given some of the history on Easter, and I had people going, "Man, I didn't know half of that stuff about Easter," So yeah, I just having fun with it, but I appreciate that. I'm glad you're enjoying it.
Well, we thank you for doing it, and so you take the time to be with your wife, and then she eventually passes. Did you call WCW, or was it still? Did Crockett still have it at the time that you come back?
No, it was WCW. Turner had already bought it. Turner had owned it when I told him I was stepping away. They, it's corporate America, and how can wrestling not be your top priority? But
wow,
it's what it is, right? It's the marketplace. But no, I did not call them. In fact, Ric Flair had the book at that. He was the booker at the time, and it probably wasn't a week after she passed, and he was calling me, for real. He invited me down to his house in Charlotte, and we had lunch poolside, and I'm probably one of, if not the only, perhaps, I don't know, maybe we'll never know, one of the only guys to turn down the world heavyweight title. He offered me the title. He said, "Man, if you'll come back, we need you. You'll come back, I'll put the strap on you, I'll put the belt on you." And I'm like, "Yeah, man, Rick, I don't know." And he goes, "No, for real, and I go, I'll think about it. I'll give it some thoughts, Rick." And I thought about it. I'm like, I think I'll pass. And he called me a few weeks later, invited me down to his house again, and pitched me a second time. So I guess you might technically, I not only turned it down once, I turned it down twice, but just wasn't, and no regrets, because people say, "Don't you wish you'd ever won the world title?" And some don't even know that it was offered to me and that I turned it down. When they hear that, they're like, "Wow, that's crazy, dude." But because they're like, I know guys who would work for free just to be able to put that belt, belt around the waist. But anyway, but I eventually, once I kind of went, through a grieving process, I eventually did go back, debuted in Phoenix, Arizona, by hitting the total package, Lex Luger upside the head with the U.S. belt. That was my debut back.
So you came back, and the story was you were mad because Luger had stolen the title from you, correct?
Correct. He did. He cheated. Not that did I ever cheat? I don't know. Well, maybe. I haven't cheated. I never cheated. J.J. Dillon threw him the chair, and he whacked me in the cage in Greensboro, and that's right. So I had what do they call that? I had a score to settle. I guess that's what I had a score to settle with Luger.
So now there you go on for another couple of years there with WCW. What are some of your thoughts about WCW during that time, management and talent wise?
Ooh, it was a different business. It shifted, and I noticed it was shifting prior to my leaving, because it shifted from a mom and pop family owned business, the Crockett family, who had it about 55 or so years, to corporate America. And it just became a chapter in Ted Turner's portfolio. And then he hired a bunch of guys. I mean, guys who knew how to make pizzas, but I was not convinced they knew how to run a wrestling company. But it was the good old boy system.
Yeah.
And that's who was running the company. And even some of the things they were doing, even the time between my going back, some of the characters and some of the stuff that I'm like, that makes no sense. It just stuff made no sense to me. And then once I got back, they were convinced I could be a heel again. And they're like, no, we'll put you against Luger because he's a hot baby face. I'm like, okay. But the thing with Magnum and teaming up with Dusty got over so strong as the superpowers. I told him, all right, if that's what you're convinced. Well, it kind of got over. It was 50-50. Mm-hmm. He and I would for the U.S. belt, and 50% would cheer for me and 50% would cheer for him. They said, okay, well, we'll put you with Sting. He's our hottest babyface. And that's where we did the thing in St. Pete where I went for Luger, he ducks, and I hit Sting. And then that creates an angle with Sting, right? And it was about 75-25. And they're like, man, I go, look, I tried to tell you. And I took a little time off there. And technically, I was without a contract. So I said, I'll be back whenever you figure out my contract. And then when I came back for my final run, that's where I made the appeal to Sting with my little Stinger, who was my oldest daughter, by the way. Now, honey, make sure when I say who's your favorite wrestler, you don't say daddy. Make sure you say. And I had her face all painted up, Anyway, that's where I made the appeal to Sting. We hugged and kissed and made up, and then I finished my career, partnering with him and several other guys before I walked away. But that said, on that note, from that point, I mean, they were just throwing me in random matches. I mean, they threw me in a cage match against Rick Rude in Minneapolis. There was no angle. They're just like, oh, this will draw. I'm like, there's no angle. They threw me with Van Vader, Big Van Vader. They were just throwing me in matches that made no sense, and therefore drew no money.
Right.
Casey, I would get there and look at the card, and they would change about 3 or 4 of the matches from what was advertised, but all the same guys would be there. I'm like, they're here. You advertise him against him. Why are you putting out him against him and him against him? I mean, it was just like, oh, Lord, anyway. Yeah, it was, looking back, it's almost like I could say I saw the right now. Of course, they went on with Monday Night Wars and all that, but it's almost like, man, almost like writing's on the wall for this company.
So you end up walking away. What was it during that time that made you go ahead and decide that you were going to retire?
My goal as a child, growing up, kind of falling in love with weightlifting and bodybuilding and football, it was kind of a pet peeve of mine. I would watch these athletes who would seem like would hang around past their prime.
Right.
And so I said, when I make it, now in those days, I was thinking it'd be pro football. But I was thinking, I'm going to have this great career in pro football, but I'm going to walk away on top. I'm not going to change to 10 different teams and whatever.
Right.
I'm going to have to run, be on top, and walk away. And when I got into wrestling, I literally told Don and Ivan that for 2 weeks, I'll be out of active wrestling, in ring wrestling by the time I'm 35. And so when I got injured in my last match against Vader, it was not career ending, but I'm rehabilitating my neck from an injury from him. And I realized the next day I ended up having a hernia, 450, 500 pound guy. I had a legit hernia surgery. So I'm rehabbing my neck, recovering from the hernia surgery. I'm like, man, it's Thanksgiving, Christmas. I'm going to be 34 years old soon. I'm like, I'm done. So My goal was 35. I beat it by a little over a year plus. I was only 33, the prime of a wrestling career, right? And I walked away, kind of coined, for the football fan out there, I've been coined the Barry Sanders of pro wrestling, or the Wayne Gretzky of hockey, if you will.
Yeah. So you leave wrestling now. Give me your testimony. What brought you to
the altar?
Yes.
So I actually write about it in a little bit about it. One of the chapters of my book. I've written 3. I got 2 available on my website right now. One's motivational, one's inspirational, one's my life story. The other one's just a very motivational, challenging book. They're on my website. But the chapter there is from success to fulfillment. So I leave wrestling. I'm on this quest of what life holds next for Nikita Koloff. And I come to the conclusion, Casey, that I'm successful in many people's eyes. I had this stellar career, multiple world titles around my waist, traveled around the world in places I never dreamed I'd ever go. And yet I'm unfulfilled. Mm-hmm. I'm like, this it? This all there is? And I'd met a Christian couple through other business ventures I was involved in, and they had invited me to church. And I didn't grow up in church. If your listeners hadn't figured it out by now, I also didn't grow up in Russia, okay, just officially. But I didn't grow up in church. I'd heard the stories about Jesus. I mean, I'd heard the stories. I just wasn't living for them. And so they had invited me, and I one day I just said, hey, I'll be there Sunday. I accepted their invitation. And that very first service in that church, I sensed something different walking in. And when it came time for what would be called an altar call, an invitation to surrender your life to Jesus, that was an aha moment. I'm like, that's what's missing in my life, is a relationship with Jesus. This man's talking about a personal relationship with Jesus. I don't have that. At best, I have a little head knowledge of who he is. And so I was first to the altar on my knees, and I can honestly say that day, upon making that decision, just receiving Jesus into my life, that sense of where there was once unfulfillment, instantaneously there was this sense of fulfillment. Also, I'm like, it's just hard to even explain it. But it was like, oh my gosh, I'm like, that it just went, the unfulfilled feeling went away. And little did I know, since that time, Casey, it's been even more of a whirlwind of a journey. I mean, from traveling now to a total of 30 different countries, preaching in 1,200 plus or minus churches. Lex Luger and I facilitate a camp called Man Camp. I do conferences called Man Up. I got the podcast, a weekly radio show. I've written books. I'm like, this is unbelievable. I never would have dreamed this in a million years, that I'd be doing what I'm doing. It's surreal in a sense. I
can definitely relate. I used to be one who would say, I'm never getting married. I, on the other hand, did grow up in church, but and I had my religious experiences, but I never had that desire to become a new creation until I was 26 years old. And I had that radical encounter with Jesus, and
wow,
transformed from then on. But I can definitely relate, because, if you would have told me 15 years ago that I was going to be standing in churches or even in wrestling rings and preaching the gospel of Jesus to people, I would have said, you are crazy.
Right. What are you smoking? What are you on? Right. I mean, for real, I get it. So we can relate. I did an interview real quick. It ties into this somewhat. You used the word religious experiences. I interviewed a pastor, actually my youngest daughter, Colby's pastor, Jeremy, on my podcast. And check this out. He's 4th generation ministry, 4 generations. I mean, his great grandfather planted churches in Pageland, South Carolina, and Lincolnton, North Carolina, through the Carolinas. His grandfather, his dad was a preacher, his brother's a preacher, his sister's a professor at Liberty. And I'm having lunch with him one day. He goes, yeah. He goes, I go, man, tell me your story. So he's telling me all this, but then he goes, yeah, I was a professional pastor for 13 years. He goes, I go, wait, you just said you've been pastoring for 25. He goes, yeah, but I was a professional for 13. I go, explain that to me. He goes, well, it wasn't until 12 years ago that God revealed to me that I had religion, but I had no relationship. I had not yet encountered Jesus.
Exactly.
And then on the podcast, he took it a step further and even talks about not only professional pastors, but professional Christians.
Mm-hmm.
Those religious experience, but maybe have yet to have that encounter that you just talked about at age 26, and that happened for me at age 34.
Right. We were just discussing that actually on last week's episode of our podcast. I've known pastors, Sunday school teachers, and, worship leaders just like that, who maybe they taught in church for years, but
right.
never truly were born.
Surrendered.
Yes.
Yeah. Never really surrendered, right?
Exactly. And, I always tell people there's absolutely nothing wrong with examining yourself and admitting, okay, I have never truly been born again.
Well, and or even if you have been born again, examine yourself often.
Right.
Don't get so prideful to think you'll never slip, or you can't slip and fall, because you surely can. You're human. So that's where we need to keep our guard up. I mentioned the man camp that Lex and I co-facilitate. I can't tell you, I've facilitated about 60 of them over the last 15 years. And I want to tell you right now, many of the guys who attend are churchgoers or grew up in church or around whatever. I can't even begin to tell you, Casey, how many guys at camp realized that same thing we're talking about. They had no relationship with Jesus. God reveals that to them at camp. And I can't even tell you how many salvations we've had at camp with guys who grew up in church or went to Christian school, or their parents were Christian, but they're just kind of living off, riding the coattails there, right?
Right. And a lot of times the ones who have religion are the hardest ones to reach because they think, hey, I've already got it.
Interesting what you say. What you just said again. The guys who are religious are the hardest ones to reach, right?
Yes.
Okay. Pause. Jesus is walking the earth. Who were the hardest ones to reach? The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the religious ones who studied the Bible, who spent hours in the synagogues, hardest ones to reach. And that is so true. The ones who have, in a sense, grown up in church, not across the board, not lumping them all together,
right.
But many, many, many times, to your point, they're the hardest ones to reach.
Exactly. That's, I said the prayer when I was 14, but then, lived like hell for the next 12 years and thought I was going to heaven. And that's where
I think that's a ploy of the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a ploy of the enemy, a ploy of Satan. They say, oh, you remember when you were 7, you prayed that prayer? You're good. You got your ticket into heaven. You're
exactly.
good. Now go life however you want to live it. I think that's a subtle ploy of the enemy and has many people duped by that.
I definitely do too. I definitely do. And that's why, whenever I am sharing Jesus with somebody, if I get the opportunity to pray with them or to, lead them to the Lord, I tell them, listen, saying this prayer is not going to save you. You can say this 1,000,000 times over, but unless you truly believe it with your heart,
heart of hearts.
Exactly. Then you're just saying words and it's not doing anything for you.
Well, in fact, Romans 10:9 says that. Believe with your heart, you confess with your mouth, and you believe with your heart. And I do the same thing. Okay? I'm like, look, this prayer has to come from the heart. It cannot, as you just said, cannot just be words. It has to come from the depth of down in your nowhere, down deep is where this prayer has to come from. And if you're and there's no cookie cutter prayer. So if you're just praying from the heart, God will recognize that, acknowledge that, and accept that and receive that. So.
Exactly. I heard a pastor say one time, and it really stuck with me. I believe that, it's good if you want to say a form of the sinner's prayer, whatever, however. But one of the things that he mentioned that really stuck out to me is he said, one of the most effective prayers is just, Jesus, I can't, you can, help. and you truly mean it with your heart.
Well, I want to take one step further since we're kind of on this vein here. Thief on the cross. So we just celebrated Jesus' resurrection recently, right?
Right.
The resurrection of Jesus. And if I'm not mistaken, there was one on the cross that said, please remember me when you come into your paradise. And he responded and said, today you'll be with me in paradise.
That's right.
There was, to my knowledge, now I wasn't there, but to my knowledge, at least it wasn't recorded in the Bible, he didn't say, okay, well, you got to say this prayer first, and then you'll be with me in paradise. He didn't say it, nor did they baptize him in water either.
Exactly.
Right? He saw the man's heart.
Yes.
And today, you'll be with me in paradise. Powerful.
Exactly right. So you mentioned that now, even though early 90s, you went back and you were mad at Lex Luger because he had stolen your United States Championship. Now you and Lex are doing some tag team in ministry with the Man Camp. And that's something that I've been wanting to talk to you about. Exactly what do you guys do and when do they take place?
So, yeah, it's been amazing. Again, amazing, in April 23rd, 2006, Lex had his encounter where he was, as he says, power washed from the inside out after his last stint in jail. And the jail chaplain led him, to the foot of the cross. And a couple months later, he and I were reconnected after 11 years. And I began to mentor and disciple him. And we began to do some ministry together in churches. He'd share his testimony. I'd preach. We did a lot of that. 2015, he lived with me for about 10 months. During that time, it was birthed the vision for a conference and a camp. So I do the conference predominantly, just called the Man Up Conference, and do it in local churches for the community. And I've already done 6 in 2021 already. I'll probably do another 10 more Man Up conferences. And then we do 2 camps currently, one in the spring, one in the fall. And I think we guys adding up today, I think we've got guys flying in and driving in, I think, from 10 different states to come to the spring camp.
That's great.
We do them in a town called Royston, Georgia. We rent a property down there from Jerome Stratton, and it's about 100 acres. And we spend 5 days. Yep, you heard me right. 5 days, and put men in a place where they can just run after the heart of God. And for many men, it's about the only time they'd ever do anything like that. They'll go hunting Bambi for 5 days. They'll go deep sea fishing for 5 days. And it's funny to challenge them to come and spend 5 days chasing the heart of God. Man, it's like a dentist pulling teeth. For the men who commit and the men who come, invariably, many of them, I won't say all of them, encounter the creator of the universe in ways they never have before. And it's men from 18 and older, men of all ages, all variety. Last year, we had a 73-year-old retired pastor who was there. This spring, we'll have a guy who lost a leg in a motorcycle wreck, so he's only got one leg. And what we do, Casey, is it's centered around 1 Thessalonians 5:23, which talks about being whole in spirit, soul, and body. What Lex and I do is we combine all of our years of experience from being a champion in the ring and in athletics, developing a championship mentality so having the right attitude, the right mindset, a healthy mind, healthy emotions, spiritually healthy. We combine our journeys together for, and chasing after the Lord ourselves, physically healthy. So we talk about that at camp, what it looks like to honor God with your body, with your temple. And our goal for all your lady listeners out there, Ladies, if this appeals to you, our goal is to send your man home better equipped to be a godly man, a godly husband, and a godly father. And I like to say, if that appeals to you, give them your blessing. They're more likely to register and come if they have your blessing. But that's what Man Camp's all about. We'll do another one in the fall. This one, I think this one in the spring is full, but we'll do another one in the spring. We limit it to a small group of guys, so it's more intimate. Right. But it's powerful, man. We're not too far from you guys. In fact, we got a guy from Chattanooga coming. Oh. So Royston, Georgia is probably a couple hours from you guys in Cleveland. So.
Well, I'll definitely need to
check it out.
The dates for the next ones, because I'd love to come and be involved. That would be a great time.
Yeah, you'll be blessed, Casey. Like, for real. I mean, you will be blessed. You will be blessed. And if people want to know, if your listeners want to know more about that, I mean, there's just one website where they can go to Koloff.net. They can go there and they can link to the Man Camp and learn more about it. They can link right to the podcast and subscribe and download and subscribe to the podcast, all right there on Koloff.net.
Okay, great. Well, I was gonna ask you how people could get in touch with you if they wanted you to come and preach at their church or autograph signings or whatever.
Yep, and they do that right through the website as well. Of course, follow me on social media, Twitter and Instagram, Facebook, and there's a store there too. The 2 books I referenced, they can purchase the books right through the store on the website as well.
That is great. What I had another fan question here that is there one guy you didn't get to wrestle, but you would have liked to?
I mean, there's probably, when you think about it, I mean, it's probably several. It probably would have been fun. Back in the day, the magazines really touted the, Koloff versus Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania, right? That was a big deal for a while back in the 80s. And it would have been fun to wrestle Hogan, and whether it was a WrestleMania or not. But there's several guys, Shawn Michaels, The Rock. I mean, there's a few guys that would have liked to have perhaps, got in the ring and scrapped with.
Yeah. All right. Well, do you have anything else that you would like to say before we wrap this up?
Well, I just appreciate the opportunity to come on and share some of my story and, help, just spread the word, right? We're teaming up together tonight, to put this broadcast together, to put this podcast together, to ultimately get the word spread, the word of God. And appreciate what you do. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you. I hope all your listeners will be blessed by the interview, and just, like I say, just check me out on social media and check out the website, and maybe for your men listeners out there, maybe I'll also meet one of them face to face at Man Camp one day as well.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we thank you very much for joining us. It was an honor to have you. I really enjoyed the conversation. Like I say with everybody, there's so much that we could continue talking. I feel like I could probably sit down with you for days and talk about Jesus. And so maybe a part 2 in the future sometime down the road. But I really appreciate you spending time with us.
We can do part 2 in the future. I'd be happy to do that. And when you come to Man Camp in the fall, guess what? We'll have days to sit down and talk about Jesus.
That's great. That's
awesome.
All right. Thank you, sir. God bless.
All right. God bless you and all your listeners out there. Thanks, Casey. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Wrestling for the Faith with Casey Kage. Sponsorship opportunities are available. Contact us at wrestlingforthefaith@gmail.com for more information.